Back in the neighborhood, the tension took another turn. A letter from the HOA arrived at the Johnsons' door, signed by none other than Mrs. Carlson herself. The letter claimed their display was still in violation of the rules, but this time it came with a hefty fine. Furious but determined to stay calm, the Johnsons decided to take the matter to the next HOA meeting, a move that quickly garnered the support of several neighbors tired of Mrs. Carlson's heavy-handed approach. At work, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. During a casual conversation in the break room, a coworker mentioned the HOA leader's strict reputation in the neighborhood. Mr. Johnson, catching on, decided to probe further, dropping subtle hints about his connection to the community. Mrs. Carlson, overhearing, froze mid-step. It was then she realized the pieces were starting to fall into place, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what might come next. The HOA meeting was packed, with more residents in attendance than ever before. Word had spread about the Johnson situation, and many came to voice their frustrations with Mrs. Carlson's leadership. She sat at the head of the table, her usual confident demeanor replaced with a flicker of unease. When the Johnsons took the floor, they spoke calmly but firmly, detailing the events that had unfolded and questioning the fairness of the fine. As the room erupted in murmurs of agreement, Mrs. Carlson tried to regain control, insisting she was only enforcing the rules. But her words faltered when Mr. Johnson stood up, his voice steady and commanding. He revealed his position as her new supervisor, and the room fell silent. Mrs. Carlson's face paled as realization washed over her. Her actions hadn't just strained neighborhood relations. They had crossed into her professional life. But then came the unexpected twist. Instead of lashing out or seeking revenge, Mr. Johnson extended an olive branch. He spoke about the importance of community, forgiveness, and working together to create a better environment for everyone. His words left the room in stunned silence before erupting into applause. Mrs. Carlson, visibly shaken, apologized to the Johnsons and the neighborhood. It was a humbling moment for her, one that marked the start of a changed perspective. As for the Johnsons, their kindness and strength turned them into respected voices in the community, proving that even in the face of conflict, compassion could lead to unexpected transformations. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to feel different. Mrs. Carlson stepped down as HOA leader, admitting that her approach had caused more harm than good. A new committee, including the Johnsons, was formed to ensure fair and inclusive decisions moving forward. The holiday display that started it all became a symbol of resilience and community, with neighbors pitching in to make it even brighter. At work, Mrs. Carlson kept a low profile but approached Mr. Johnson privately to express her gratitude for his grace. Their professional relationship, while still formal, carried a newfound respect. The Johnsons, meanwhile, focused on what mattered most: their family and the sense of belonging they had helped create. As they stood outside one evening, watching their lights twinkle against the night sky, Mr. Johnson smiled. Sometimes challenges bring unexpected opportunities to remind everyone of the power of kindness and second chances. It was supposed to be a joyful holiday season, but things took an unexpected turn in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The Johnson family, excited to celebrate their first Christmas in their new home, worked together to create a dazzling holiday display. Their decorations brought smiles to passersby, until the head of the HOA, Mrs. Carlson, showed up. Known for her strict rules and no-nonsense attitude, she marched up to the Johnsons' yard, claiming their decorations violated neighborhood guidelines. Without warning, she tore down their display, ignoring their pleas. Little did she know, Mr. Johnson had recently been promoted at work, and his new role would soon cross paths with hers in a way she never expected. What happens when the lines between personal and professional lives blur? Stay tuned to find out how this unexpected twist turns the tables and teaches a lesson about kindness, respect, and second chances. The Johnsons were no strangers to hard work and community spirit. They had moved into the neighborhood just a few months earlier, hoping for a fresh start. Mr. Johnson, a dedicated professional, had recently earned a well-deserved promotion after years of commitment to his job. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson was focused on settling their two young kids into their new school and building connections with their neighbors. But Mrs. Carlson saw things differently. She had been the self-appointed enforcer of HOA rules for years, and to her, the Johnsons' vibrant holiday display didn't fit the neat and uniform aesthetic she prized. She didn't bother to introduce herself or explain her actions, just stormed in, dismantling their decorations piece by piece. The Johnsons were stunned but decided to keep their composure. What Mrs. Carlson didn't realize was that her brash decision was about to unravel her own life in a way she couldn't have predicted. In the days following the incident, the Johnson family tried to move on, focusing on rebuilding their holiday display. Neighbors began to notice the tension, and whispers about Mrs. Carlson's harsh behavior started circulating. Some residents quietly approached the Johnsons, apologizing for what had happened and sharing their own run-ins with the overzealous HOA leader. It was clear Mrs. Carlson had a reputation for overstepping boundaries, but no one had ever challenged her directly. Meanwhile, at work, Mr. Johnson was preparing to step into his new role as the department supervisor. As he reviewed the list of employees under his management, a familiar name caught his eye: Deborah Carlson. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just a coincidence. But during an introductory meeting, the truth became glaringly obvious. There she was, the same Mrs. Carlson who had torn down his family's display, now sitting across the table from him, completely unaware of his connection to the Johnson family. As the days passed, Mrs. Carlson remained oblivious to Mr. Johnson's identity. At work, she maintained her usual demeanor, offering polite but distant greetings to her new supervisor. Mr. Johnson, on the other hand, wrestled with how to handle the situation. Should he confront her directly or let her behavior speak for itself? He decided to observe, hoping her actions would reveal more about her character in this new environment. At home, the Johnsons finally finished restoring their holiday display, refusing to let Mrs. Carlson's actions dim their festive spirit. But the tension in the neighborhood continued to simmer. More residents began to share their frustrations, emboldened by the Johnsons' quiet resilience. Then a new complication arose. At an important workplace meeting, Mrs. Carlson was tasked with presenting a project update. Nervously addressing the room, she stumbled over her words when Mr. Johnson asked a pointed question. Her confidence faltered, and she began to sense something familiar about his voice and demeanor, but couldn't quite place it. The unease in the air was undeniable, setting the stage for a revelation that no one would see coming. The uneasy feeling lingered for Mrs. Carlson after the meeting. She couldn't shake the sense that something was off about her new supervisor. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson kept his composure, hiding the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. At home, he shared the day's events with his wife, who suggested it might be time to address what had happened. But Mr. Johnson wasn't ready to reveal everything. He wanted to see how the situation would unfold naturally.